Parables leave a lot to our imagination. These are brief stories that explain truths that are beyond themselves. In the passage that we're about to hear, the gospel writer tells us the meaning of the parable up front, to make a case for a consistent prayer, and to remain encouraged. Luke tells us what Jesus is about to tell his disciples. And the writer also names the literary form employed in teaching this lesson. Now, a parable is different from a metaphor or a simile, even though they do have some characteristics that are the same. Metaphors and similes draw comparisons. Metaphors are utilized to make an abstract concept concrete. For instance, to proclaim that someone has a heart of gold uses gold as a metaphor, right? A metaphor for loving and giving and being honest. And similes draw an even more direct comparison. Think of the expression, sly like a fox. Like being the key word here, right? A simile recognizes a particular characteristic of one being and attributes it to another. So, here's the big question. Why the grammar lesson this morning? Because sometimes we treat parables like metaphor or simile instead of letting them stand on their own. But that's not the work of a parable. A parable offers a much deeper and broader meaning to the story, and it begs us to use our imagination or use our creativity in coming to understand the deeper meaning that's intended for us to receive. So, bearing all of this in mind, we come to today's parable from the Gospel according to Luke.
Today's reading is from Luke chapter 18, verses 1 through 8. Justice for the faithful. Jesus was telling them a parable about their need to pray continuously and not to be discouraged. He said, "In a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor respected people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to him, asking, 'Give me justice in this case against my adversary.' For a while he refused, but finally said to himself, 'I don't fear God or respect people, but I will give this widow justice because she keeps bothering me. Otherwise, there will be no end to her coming here and embarrassing me.' The Lord said, 'Listen to what the unjust judge says. Won't God provide justice to his chosen people who cry out to him day and night? Will he be slow to help them? I tell you, he will give them justice quickly. But when the human one comes, will he find faithfulness on earth?'" This ends the reading.
As Diana was reading that, I had the thought that maybe that'd be the way that, negotiate. We got a salary coming up. Just be persistent, right? No, not really. I'm just kidding. I read a devotion this week that I think really gets at the deeper meaning of today's text. And it seems that some years before the Civil War ended slavery, Frederick Douglass, you remember Frederick Douglass from history. Well, Frederick Douglass's energy for the abolition movement was running out. He was experiencing depression. He said because he was depressed because if God had really intended for black Americans to be liberated, then why hadn't God done anything yet? And what's even worse is Douglass was slated to give a big speech that night, a speech that he lacked the will to give. Now, the story goes that Sojourner Truth herself stared at his weary face from across the room. And seeing his despondence, she opened up her mouth and she hollered at him at the top of her lungs, "Frederick, is God dead?" Startled out of his despair, Douglass stood up and he found his voice. And he kept on going for decades after that, seeking justice and equality. Now, like Douglass, our work for justice can lead us to depression. The night can sometimes seem so long, impossibly long. How can such horrors, suffering, such violence and warmongering, such stuckness, such polarization, such fear and distress and confusion, how can they possibly continue? If God was going to fix it, whatever it is, surely God would have done it by now, right? Which brings us to our parable. Remember, first of all, this is not a metaphor or a simile. Applying those understandings of language would suggest that the unjust judge represents the perspective of God. And that would be an affront to the character of God. The judge, if anything, personifies injustice itself. The judge doesn't care about anything outside of his own interests, divine or human. He seems quite proud of that fact. It's not Jesus' characterization. The judge defines himself in that manner. And injustice is like that. It boldly and unapologetically disdains compassion and sympathy. It cannot be bothered by the cares or concerns of the creation or the Creator. The judge is not only a barrier to justice, as one given authority and responsibility to render it, his refusal to even consider her case means the judge embodies injustice. How can one ever expect to receive justice from injustice? Now, on the other hand, we have this vulnerable widow who acts with persistent courage. And she's the quintessential outsider, right? The one who's on the lowest rung of the societal ladder. In comparison with the judge, she represents a persistent and ongoing pursuit of justice. Are you beginning to kind of see the deeper message coming together here? I think it's important for us at this point to take a pause and to remember that this portion of the Lucan narrative is laser focused on this idea of justice. So this is no idle story. It's a lesson with real life consequences. The disciples, after Jesus' physical departure, will depend upon their ability to adapt and live in this model that Jesus has presented to them. And it's equally important to note that the exemplar Jesus represents is displayed through this widow. And again, she's the outsider, the poor, the marginalized. Jesus over and over again takes someone from the margins of the margin and places them in the center as a model of behavior, as he exhorts his closest friends to emulate. So it begs the question then, what does this deeper meaning about being persistent in the pursuit of justice mean for us? Well, Archbishop Desmond Tutu said of the pursuit of justice, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, then you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has his foot on the tail of a mouse and you say that you're neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality." Well, it seems to me that the elephant still has its foot on the tail of the least of God's people. And that's the bottom line here. Will we stand back and stand by while the mouse gets stepped on? Or will we use our privilege? Will we use our voice and our vote? Will we use our faith and our action to stand up for the mouse? Will we speak for the ones who have been silenced? Will we advocate for those who cannot stand up for themselves? Will we pursue justice with the same veracity that we, cheer for the Packers or the Vikings or the Bears, I don't want to take sides here. Anyway, the deeper message here is the relentless, ongoing quest for justice. And even though the road may seem long and it may seem dark, there is a light at the end, and that light is Christ. One final thought this morning. This passage about justice is wrapped in a teaching about prayer, right? Well, it occurs to me that the relentless pursuit of justice is in reality its own form of prayer. Think of it like this. Nonviolent protest is a kind of a prayer service. Writing letters and emails to elected officials advocating for the least of God's people is like writing in a prayer journal. refusing to accept anything less than the God-given vision and the American ideal of liberty and justice for all should prompt us as people of faith to challenge the systems of oppression and the authorities who perpetuate them over and over and over again. As the great civil rights leader Ella Baker once said, "We who live in freedom cannot rest until it comes." We who live in freedom cannot rest until it comes. The widow in this parable did not rest until she got justice. And guess what? She didn't let that unjust judge rest either. Maybe that should be our mantra as well. May our prayer, our consistent, our constant, our relentless prayer be, give us justice. May it be so for me and for you.